Thank you all for being here this morning. I know it was a long night for a bunch of you, myself included, but I think this is a session worth coming out to. This is the main session of all our plenaries that's focused on climate change. Climate change, one can easily make the case, and I think people will be for the next hour, is the critical issue of our time. It's the critical issue if we don't solve, we may not have time, and it needs to be addressed. I feel tremendously fortunate that everybody on this panel is not only a colleague, but someone I consider to be a friend. Here's what we're gonna do. Let me just say this as plainly as I can. We're gonna have a presentation first by David Miller by screen, and I will tell you why he's on screen, for about 20 minutes about approaches to climate change for cities. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who David is in just a second. We're then going to go to our panel of extraordinarily eminent scholars here, and folks you mostly know. I will introduce them. I'll tell you their names in a second, and then we'll introduce them as they each come up, who are going to talk about what we know from social, behavioral, environmental, psychological, and environmental design research that might be useful in understanding how the kinds of programs for climate change that Dame is going to be describing might be improved, evaluated, assessed, aided, those kinds of things. And we hope we'll have time to also extend to audience discussion, because I think that's the whole idea. So first, let me tell you about David Miller. David Miller, again, and I hope this doesn't sound too saccharine. I feel extremely lucky that I can call David Miller a friend. David was mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010. What happened to the mayoralty in Toronto immediately afterwards, he had nothing to do with. But I can tell you that people in Toronto loved him. And whenever I went out anywhere with David to lunch, walking down the street in Brooklyn, Canadians would come running up to us saying, "David, if only you were still there, we love you." I swear that happened every time. He went on from being mayor of Toronto to being head of the WWF Canada. That's not the Wrestling Federation, that's the World Wildlife Fund of Canada. He may be able to wrestle. He's a good athlete and he's into sports. He was also an advisor on urban issues to the World Bank. He was, when he was mayor, director of several aspects of the C40, followed, I believe, by Mayor Bloomberg in that. And he was in between, which clearly was his greatest distinction ever, an urban fellow, a fellow for urban futures at the Polytechnic Institute of Technology, before it was subsumed by NYU, otherwise known as Engulf and Devour. And that's where we got to teach courses together, and I got to know David. So he is now the director of C40 North America. If you don't know, C40 is an organization that was started originally of the 40 biggest cities in the world, with the mayors as the active members. And the goal of the C40 is to address climate change with active proposals. So I'm going to stop in a second to let David start speaking with you and to you. Let me just say who's on the panel. We have first, well, I guess this is in order of how we're going to approach people. We have Robert Gifford, who is a distinguished professor from the University of Victoria in British Columbia. I'm sure you all know Bob. He's been the editor. He was editor for a number of years of the Journal of Environmental Psychology, has done research on climate change, helped write the white papers for the American Psychological Association, and is a winner of the Edra Career Award, although he wasn't lucky enough to get the award on a moving boat in the East River. We also have Irina Fagina, who I have my note on here if I can only find it, but I know Irina, so I'll apologize if I don't say everything exactly right that Irina's done. Irina is a graduate of social psychology here at NYU. I was lucky enough to be part of her dissertation committee. She actually, unusually at NYU, did a dissertation that was essentially conservation psychology. She has been a fellow at the White House. She has been a triple AAS fellow working with a senator in the Senate, oddly enough, who is one of the 575 people running for president right now. Is anybody in the room not running for president? We can talk. And has done brilliant work. She worked for a number of years as the chief behavioral scientist for Climate Action, Climate Central in Princeton, and is going to be, and has, I believe, has a unique perspective on approaching these kinds of issues. We have Linda Schneekloth, a emeritus professor of landscape architecture at the University of Buffalo, part of the SUNY system in New York. And there are many credits I could give to Linda. She's part of the caucus partnership with partner Bob Shibley, which really focuses on communication and community involvement for change. But I think the key thing I want to tell you about Linda is that she is the most passionate person I know about getting people to recognize the danger and risk of climate change and getting people to act on it, and has taken her own advice. She has turned, essentially, as best I can tell, her post-professorial career over to making, outside of, I'm sure, spending wonderful time with her grandchildren, to almost exclusively making responses to climate change happen and possible. They will all tell you important things about themselves that I miss, I'm sure, as they come up. And we also have Ricardo Garcia Mira, professor of environmental psychology from A Coruña, Spain, recently president of IAPS, up till very recently a member of parliament in Spain, and had part of his portfolio was dealing with the environmental and climate change issues for Spain, which makes me feel they were in much better hands than locally. Ricardo's research is very clearly focused on climate change and behavioral and social issues and culture as it relates to climate change. So I think all of these people will have interesting things to say. And there I introduced them now instead of later, so it shows you how much I know. So let me proceed now and ask David. David, we still have a connection, and you can hear me and we can hear you, I believe. Let me ask David to take the time that he needs to tell you about his thoughts about cities and climate change and what they can and should be doing now, and then we'll come back to more discussion.
Well, Rich, first of all, thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. I assume people can still hear me, and will tell me that I apologize for being unable to be there in person. It sounds like there was a time last night, and the conference itself is very impressive. I do appreciate being able to be part of it, and I'm going to try and hold my remarks for about 15 minutes because I'm very interested to hear my fellow panelists and their comments, particularly about behavioral psychology and communications and how we actually motivate people to act on climate. So my comments are going to be informed by my experience both with Mayor of Toronto, as true C40, Rich pointed out, while I was mayor and now as director of C40 for North America, I'm going to call them soul, which is a bit provocative, but it represents my non-academic view of the issue of climate change, which is that it's so overwhelming that it sometimes paralyzes people from action. And my theory is that the leadership and actions of the mayors of the world's major cities not only can help address climate change, and I'll get into that a little bit in a couple of minutes, but also can demonstrate to people that they can have faith and hope that we can overcome this challenge. And therefore, in a way, it's the actions and leadership of those mayors that are going to lead the way out of the climate crisis. And that's why I'm calling my presentation Solve, because that leadership is what will solve the challenge, not the leadership from my perspective of national government. And of course, it can individually address the need for collective action. So I think I should speak a little bit about the C40, building on what Rich mentioned. So the C40 was founded in 2005 by former Mayor Ken Livingston of London, England. And it was founded to help the world avoid dangerous climate change through leadership and action of the mayors of the world's flood cities. And Ken's speech was fairly simple. His thesis was that mayors of the world's major cities like Paris, London, New York, Jakarta, Beijing, and of course Toronto, have a unique platform in the public support of the country. And secondly, because of the unique responsibility of the city, they're active to address climate change as well. So his idea was national government are not doing it, they're not doing climate change. It's the next step of crisis. The world, human populations, and the leadership of these mayors and the action of their city can help the world avoid climate change. There's been a built-up ideas. Mayor Holberg in particular was transformative chair. Really appeared to these mayors and if you're around Bethany, the Northern Capture, so San Francisco is leading a global effort that over 3,000 people carried on to dramatically lower weight. And they've always been a leader globally. They're one of the first cities to have weight waste, compost, organic, and have an advantage recycling program. Protecting the years not good waste in the first place. But when it is produced, it's extremely important and provided a lot of methane, a very dangerous greenhouse gas. These cities are working strongly on that issue as well. And part of our responsibility with these 40 cities in North America are to help our cities globally think about equity and jobs. And how do we make issues of equity in the range of climate change to mitigate the annual adaptation? Part of the philosophy in that is that the climate change is unfair. Forest people globally and often the forest people within a city are impacted the most by extreme weather events, by pollution, by air quality issues. So it's essential if mayors are going to retain the authority and the support of their residents to act on climate change, to ensure that the remedies are helping the least well off. And that's what we see from lead mayors like New York and Los Angeles at this time for example. But what I see from my team are global leaders working with the residents of their city to build programs that address sources of greenhouse gas emissions in cities to build the transportation, electricity, and waste in ways to build equity, build a better city, or a more living city. And in most cases, that's how the climate challenge is going to be solved, not just on those practical measures, but on the way that these actions demonstrate that it is in fact possible to address climate change, even when you have a national government that chooses not to. And I think by giving people the hope that we can make change, they'll be more likely to cooperate and indeed push elected officials to take the necessary measures when they're hard to do. That's really what I wanted to say today by way of introduction. I look forward to hearing the presentation of the panelists and what the questions. I look forward to listening to that. Thanks so much for your time and attention, and I very much apologize for being unable to be here today. And look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I don't know if you could hear it, but there was a round of applause there. And interesting looks on faces as you spoke about that unnamed government that chooses not to recognize climate change. If the panel would come on up, I think maybe, and take these chairs up front, it might be a good thing. And Bob, I think I would like to ask you to address issues first. I think we'll go in that order, if we can, that I described a few minutes ago. Okay. So I'll pass this microphone around. And David, I'm assuming you're going to be able to hear everybody because they'll have the same microphone.
Yeah, I can hear.
Oh.
Check, check. One, two.
No, they're be given their own microphones.
They're very lucky people.
That's right. Can they take those home with them too when they're done? Is that okay? Okay. Okay, Bob. Let's just keep this as informal as we can. Go ahead and say what you think is appropriate to say. Okay, we can see. We have a cooperative behavior. We get one of you guys down to help with the mic? Here, this one I know works.
Hello. Okay. Cool. So thanks to David for that presentation. And as for me, I only learned relatively recently the role of cities as the level of instrument for mitigating and adapting to cities through beginning a program in my university called Human Dimensions of Climate Change, in which people from all over campus who had different expertise levels come in and talk to me. And my own sort of epiphany in this regard was a lawyer who came and educated me to the fact that cities tend to have control and oversight on more of the levers of change than other levels of government, including individuals, do. So, you know, again, to bring up the topic that somebody else brought up, the federal level is not all that important, really. I mean, of course, leadership, modeling is important, but in terms of where are the levers that make a difference, it tends to be at the city level. And you know, I'm sure David would agree that it's also the smaller cities and municipalities where there's control over such things as building bylaws and sometimes utilities and whatever. And so this was my own personal epiphany, was that municipalities and city levels are very important. My own thinking and research has focused kind of on the negative side. The dragons of inaction are the many excuses, reasons, justifications that individuals use to not take action in climate, even though they may well believe that there's a problem. And I guess one of the points that strikes me is that cities can do all kinds of wonderful things, but they have to elect people who will do those things. You need social license for that, and so it's very important as a psychologist to think of the voters, the people who elect the people in the city government who will do the right kind of thing. And I just do that because that's what I think about, is that kind of individual level. So if I have something like 5 minutes, it's pretty hard for me to talk for 5 or 10 minutes, but I'll do my best here. But here's the short list, the elevator speech about what I think are the solutions that cities and individuals need to do or to attempt to do. First is, of course, to make climate change personal. Well, the little joke in my family is that I said, nobody cares what's happening in Uruguay, and the last talk that I did, somebody was from Uruguay and raised her hand and corrected me about that. But what I mean is we have spatial discounting. That is, we tend not to think about things that are far away as being particularly important. So we have to make climate change local and present and personal as much as possible. So cities should try to do that. Second, we have to make climate change emotional, although not negative emotions, positive emotions. And we have to make it a kind of an experience for people. When people experience things personally, then they vote for the right people to get elected. Third, we need to exploit, which is kind of a negative word, take advantage of social organizations, local networks. And when I give longer talks, I always say, you should be active, whether it's in your household, your neighborhood, your workplace, your school, and be developing a network, because we get a lot of strength from other people as we're moving ahead. To be isolated and trying to do something can be very difficult. So form groups, join groups at whatever level that you're comfortable at. And next, I would say the point is to make it, climate change is a negative thing, but we can try to make it a positive thing in the sense of what are the gains to be made from working against the ravages of climate change. How will we be a better society? How will we be better parents, grandparents, citizens by helping out? And then it makes it a positive thing. In the US, at least one study has shown that even among the kind of cool white dudes who are not so keen on climate change, if you tie it to patriotism, for example, you can get better results. So you have to find the hook for different kinds of hooks for different kinds of people. And even the cool white dude from Texas who's not in Austin or Houston is going to resonate with what's important. And since climate change is going to touch everything, what's important for you? Is it your grandchildren? Is it pure streams, better wildlife? Let's find the hook that works for you and show how that's going to be important for climate change. The last thing is framing climate change in terms of different kinds of messages and interventions that will be effective. It's very important, I think. There have been a number of campaigns that have not been very effective. So one thing that people in my lab and other environmental psychologists are doing are trying to find the right messages and the right messages for different people. There's at least 22 different kinds of A versus B messages that are out there being explored right now in different kinds of interventions. Since I just, I'm trying to save time for everybody else, I'll just tell you about one. In one big study, we compared telling people that climate change is something we're all going to have to sacrifice to overcome and mitigate, and we told the other half of people that you can be a kind of local hero if you help out with climate change, and then we checked their at least reported behavior later, and it won't surprise most of you to know that the empowerment message was much more effective than the sacrifice message. So generally, we need a positive message. We have to pick the intervention strategies that work and test them with testing programs and which ones did work better, improve them, etc. Make it a kind of positive personal experience. Then people will vote for city councilors and municipal elected people who will then do the right thing at the city level, which, as I said at the beginning, I'm sure David would agree with, is the place that has the most potential for making change at the kind of governmental levels of government. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, just before we move on, if there's a clarification question that anybody wants to ask Bob right now, we can have one. Otherwise, we'll move on and we'll have hopefully more time for questions after. Okay, I'm seeing Bob. If you've read his textbook, he's extraordinarily clear, so that was obviously great. Irina Fagina, we're passing mics around. Great.
Still on. Hi, everyone. Well, you covered most of it, but
I was going to hope that I didn't steal anybody's thunder, so I see Ricardo rapidly making new notes.
So just to add a couple of things. First of all, I think the idea of solutions implemented by cities is really important because for so long we've been emphasizing the problem, and that's gotten a lot of backlash because it's overwhelming, it's scary. There's also a huge ideological campaign around it, and that has really plugged into the fear that the reality of climate change brings up in people. And the shift to focusing on solutions is a complete turnaround in terms of how we approach it. And I think for many of us as scientists or people who are engaged in knowledge production, the idea of understanding the problem and then coming up with solutions is very intuitive. But actually for people, that's not at all the case. People aren't used to reasoning through global scale, immense problems, and then sort of deciding on best case, best promise sort of solutions, etc. And so I think what we've been doing is placing this burden on people rather than understanding that typically we respond to information about how to move forward, what aligns with our lives, what promotes our interests, etc. And so I think a focus on solutions is far more effective. And if you look at ideological differences and support around various facets of climate change, there's, in America especially, a huge divide between liberals and conservatives, with liberals much more engaged, conservatives much less. But actually, when you look at solutions, that's not at all the case. So as long as people don't perceive the solutions as being a kind of way of handing over their lives to government control, they're actually very interested in solutions and willing to engage in them, even if they don't believe in climate change. And so I think that is very important to keep in mind. And that plugs into what you're saying about the importance of what empowers us and what gives us a sense of sort of future hope, even if it's at a collective level and it requires a larger action that we can take personally. I think that sense of shared reality around something is imperative for people to not feel despair and be able to act. And one thing that I want to underline is, even though we all like to think of ourselves as individuals and people who are, have formed our identities and have very particular preferences, we actually still mostly do what is considered okay by the groups that we belong to. So we align our behaviors. And, we may do that in unique ways, etc. But, consider basic things like, would you have come here without a shirt on? Or, things that really, we take as absolutely a given, but in fact they're just social conventions. And so when we create programs and environments that model certain behaviors, that is actually the absolutely most effective way to get somebody to do something. Not telling them about it, not, giving them nitty-gritty details about how it works, but actually just creating an environment where that behavior is implicit and where they're getting the information that this is how we do things here, and that also this is what we do in order to be valued members of the group. That goes a very long way, and I think we haven't been using that tool as much as we could be, but given that, this is a room of experts at creating environments that communicate things to people implicitly, I think this is so important to utilize and to harness. And the other thing, also echoing what you said, Bob, is that in the end, people will do that which aligns with their needs and their motives and their immediate needs. And our most important motive is to protect what we love and to belong to groups and to be valued members of those groups. And I think the more that we make solutions about that, rather than about climate change as something out there, but rather about what's pertinent in our lives, whether it's children or work or business or whatever, then we have that direct path towards engagement. And I think the last thing I want to say is around power dynamics. So climate change is a huge pressing issue, and a lot of people have gotten involved in working on it. But actually, the things that have caused it and also the implications of solutions are also about social justice and inequality and economics, etc. And many people have been dealing with other repercussions of what has now caused climate change in other ways. And I think when we come in and just address this one issue, in a way we're discounting a lot of realities of the implications of our social systems. And I think that's less so the case here, where there's a lot of awareness of this, but I still want to underline that I think we are working on this issue and issues of economics and social structure at the same time. And I think the more we can understand where we come into that structure as practitioners and scientists, and the kind of power that we are given by our position and the ways in which we represent the system, which also we're struggling with, I think the more we're able to create conversations that really get people on board with what we're offering. Thanks.
I thank you, and Rich, thank you for inviting me. I think probably the most important thing to remember is the fact that if there ever were a human environment problem, climate change is it. And my hope and aspiration is that people connected with EDRA, people who really are concerned about that, will take this on. And it was interesting to me to look through the program and not to actually see more about climate issues as the probably major cultural issue of our day. So I'm going to start with that. I also really want to affirm the cities, starting with cities. We talk about powers and authorities. Who can do what? And as Bob pointed out, that cities actually have a lot of power. And so therefore, we would hope, and I'm just delighted at the C40 program, because here is people taking the power that they actually have, the privilege that they actually have, and taking action. I also want to say that cities are amazing makings. We've made cities. Cities human beings make cities. They're like our hives or swarms or whatever it is. And probably there's no more important thing that we need to do than withdraw from the rest of the earth. And so therefore the need for beautiful, wonderful, functional cities is going to have to be even more important. We haven't done a very good job with cities. They're actually pretty new in human history, and that we need to think about if we're going to continue the population increase or the continue population at all, that we're going to need to have that. I mean, think about the book like Half Lives, Half Earth. The idea that we have to withdraw from the earth in significant ways, and the best way for us to do that, human beings, is to be in cities. I like to use a framework that was developed by, it's called Act of Hope, by Joanne Macy and Chris Johnstone. Sometimes it's really helpful to have three things. One thing they say is stop bad things. Second thing is do good things. And the third thing is shift culture. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, but it is an easy and interesting way to think about how we're approaching and how we're doing climate change. And actually, if you think about the C40 program, is that they're stopping the bad things. They are doing good things. And the shifting of the culture is happening because those people who live in cities and those of us who are familiar with it are seeing that action is possible. Look at that. You can do this. You can take steps to make climate change happen. Not happen, to unhappen. Most of my work to date has been in the concept of placemaking, which is how people make connections to place. We have within our field a lot of information about place attachment, about how do people connect to their places. In addition to that, how do people connect to each other in places? How do they create beloved communities? We know that loneliness is a major problem in the culture that we have created. So here in the placemaking strategies that we're having, we're very interested in how indeed you start to do that. My question, and the thing I've been struggling with lately, is how do we make place attachments to Earth? Earth is our home. We evolved here. And that we have created a culture that has totally separated us from the earth. We no longer understand that we frankly are totally dependent on the functioning of the earth, and somehow or another think that we have some kind of a co-relationship, that we are contributors, where in point of fact we are mass users and consumers of the earth. I just have a few things that came. I don't know if you've been following a lot of the biodiversity research that's been coming out right now, but to me a couple of things are interesting. They said that insects, which outweigh human beings 17 times, are in rapid decline. I don't know about you, but I remember thousands of lightning bugs when I was a kid. And do you ever see lightning bugs anymore? No. So you can start to see it, and the research is showing that that's the case. 70% of all birds on Earth are poultry. Now, that means that for us, it means that they're not birds, Mammals, 60% of mammals are livestock, and 36% are humans, which means that only 4% of mammals are wild. And already in 1930, at the beginning of the last New Deal, it says 5/6 of the original indigenous animal populations had already been wiped out, and 7/8 of the original woodlands had been cleared to make room for settlement. So we, who represent like 0.01% of the beings on Earth, are actually consuming and using and taking up all of this other space. So this idea of our ability to be able to withdraw and to not consume so much of the earth, and to think about how we, not just sustainability, not just resilience, but how do we start to regenerate? How do we think about an analogous way of us functioning with the earth so that we give back as much as we take? This is a fascinating question, and actually is very, very challenging for all of us to sort of think about how we begin to replace the story that we've created about human superiority and separation with one about interbeing. And I agree that I know that when we communicate with people, we have to sort of start where they are, but most people are not really very happy right? I mean, there's a lot of data to suggest that that's the case. And the thing that they really want more than anything else is connection. They want to belong. They want to be part of a community. So how do we create the structures that allow people to do that, to move into regeneration, past even sustainability and resilience? To come back to the word of ecology, economics. Eco means home. It's your home. That's what ecology means. It's like the dynamics of your home. The economy is supposed to be the management of home. It's not about making profit. It's not about making money. It's about managing your home. And we need to figure out ways to manage ourselves on this earth as a part of the larger community. So Rich mentioned that in Buffalo that I've been working a lot with people, communities of people in climate justice. And I want to just mention it for a minute because it's been very exciting to figure out ways to weave relationships among people who normally don't talk to each other very much. And over the last 5 years, that we have been able to weave a larger movement that includes the environmental organizations, the social justice organizations, the interfaith groups, the youth, all in what we call a climate justice movement that's trying to excite people about the possibility of creating a world that actually is just and fair, that people in ecology understand the social justice issues, the people in social justice understand that all of the earth degradation that's going on is actually an erosion of ecology, an erosion of their own personal ecology, so that the conversations can be had across large groups of people. I'm a little bit like Greta Thunberg, you know, the 15-year-old Swedish girl who says, I don't understand why everybody isn't talking about climate change all the time. And I know I drive everybody crazy all the time talking about this because I think we are at a crossroads, a significant crossroads. And we're either going to create a marvelous, wonderful, sustainable, beloved community here on this planet, or we're not. And so I encourage all of you to think about wherever you are in your human environment field, to think about what are the consequences of climate change on you and the work that you're doing, and what can we do to move that conversation forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Hola, hola, hola.
I just want to note that I haven't had to give a time check to anybody yet. You guys are doing a great job on keeping on schedule. Go ahead, Ricardo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David Miller, for this good presentation, and thank you to Richard Winner for inviting me to be here. I feel honored to share this floor with very well-known experts that I know very well. Well, Richard said that I am a social psychologist, but I have been also during the last 3 years as a member of the parliament, with the responsibility of being the spokesman for the socialist group in the Spanish parliament. So I had the opportunity to receive a lot of organizations regarding the Spanish law for climate change, and I had the opportunity also to learn a lot of things that we usually don't work with in our research work. No? And this is related to how the decision-making process is. No? So being in a parliament means that you have to follow all the itinerary that political parties prefer for making decisions, and this has been very slowly developed, no? In terms of development of what a democracy is, or what a democratic society is. Political parties are very reluctant to develop this part of the decision making, the part which involves organizations, which involve people, which involve associations, and this introduces very a lot of resistances that that go in the opposite side, that the urgency that climate action requires. So what I learned was also that when I tried to introduce some participative strategy working with environmental organizations or citizens organizations, well, I was stopped. No? Because the more time you dedicate to organizations, the less control the political party perceive that they have on the decisions. So political tactics are more important than introducing strategies for developing something in an urgent way for the general interest. No? So, well, another idea that I would like to underline is that the general need to vertebrate the society, no, as a consequence of the statement that I said before. Specifically in subjects like climate change action that are important and urgent for the general interest. The need also to establish a set of categories in cities, a set of categories in municipalities that can be engaged for this climate action. But the first thing that the cities and municipalities have to learn is that the citizens are not working only locally anymore, like it was in the past, like it was years and years or decades ago. Now we work in a global way. We work in networks of interest, in professional networks, in networks of users. Well, and not only in a network. We make decisions based in the information and in the engagement that we commit with many networks. So these networks have to be connected as they are in our individual lives. So information doesn't depend only on, the personal engagement or social engagement doesn't depend only on the information that we already have. I can say that we have seen during the last decades an overproduction of information about what climate change is or how serious it is. No? We need to take into account not only the information, but only the individual processes and the relation that the individual establishes with the environment. And this relation is what I was commenting when I spoke about my experience with groups within the parliament, trying to introduce some facilitating process that allows to introduce decisions in an horizontal way, no? And not in a top-down, no, way. The real fact is that politicians only receive the information only receive proposals, but we have no guarantee that they will be implemented. So this is not really a participation process. This is not a bi-directional process. It's only monodirectional, unidirectional. So we need to introduce changes in many aspects of our lives. When I see the C40 organization, well, I have to connect what you are doing, no? Which is very memorable and very important, with the project that the European Commission is the strategy that the European Commission is promoting through the framework program for research and innovation, where we are participating through the Connecting project, which is a project that tries to implement nature-based solutions, no? Working with cities, working with networks, and working with all of these aspects that I mentioned before. And we have found in this project, which is not only a social innovation strategy or a climate change strategy, it's also an economic and financial strategy, because Europe wants to be competent economically in production of solutions based in nature. So, and is competing with China and competing also with the United States in production of all the products that the cities need to import to copy with the impact of the climate change, with the more negative impacts. So we have established two categories of cities. The first of one is the front-runner cities. We would consider the C40 organization as an organization of front-runner cities. These are cities that already have implemented solutions to mitigate the negative impact of the climate change. They have implemented policies that allow them to adapt to impact of climate change. And the second category is the fast followers cities, those cities that have a potential for being engaged at a medium term or in the long term as a front runner. So we have to connect all these cities, no, in a network in such a way that the fast followers can learn from the front runner, and we need to make decisions affecting both categories and other categories that we can create in the middle or in the local context, no? As a consequence of, as you said before, no, all the cities are open to the same kind of policies because we have different contexts, different territories, different economies. And finally, the third idea that I would like to, and with this idea I finished, is it has to do with the policies for engaging in climate action. We don't need only one policy. We need a combination of policies, and we need to know what is this combination in terms of detecting what is the tipping point that can activate a change as a consequence of this combination, and how these policies have to be implemented all together in a row or one behind the other. What is more, well, we have carried out some research regarding this in a project for reducing emissions in the workplace, where we have made a social simulation using artificial intelligence competency for simulating how different combinations or how different ways of implementing policies or combination of policies can produce different impacts or can be absolutely unuseful. No? So, well, all these things that connect policy, research have to be more developed, and it needs and climbs for more developing, because there are many resistances that are very well identified, and we need to work on it. Thank you very much.
Okay. First of all, I'm sure there's questions out there and comments. I have a number of my own, but I'm going to have plenty of time to chat with these folks here and other places, so I want to make sure everybody else has a shot. Let me first ask David if he has a particular question that he'd like to ask the panel, and then we'll open it up to any comments and questions anyone else has.
Rich, first of all, I want to thank you. I found the discussion really fascinating. I don't want to take the down.
I'm sorry, David, we're losing you a little bit. If you could hold that mic on the string up to your mouth, I think it might be better. There you go.
Can you hear that?
That's better, yes.
So I thought the panel was excellent in some of the thinking about communicating and about building community and about a vision around reconnecting the earth. It's very helpful. My role, and I'll follow the panelists directly. I think that's the best thing we need to do. I just want to tell Ricardo that his point about front runner cities, fast follower cities is really excellent, and one that we're going to try and implement in ways like knowledge and basis. I'll be like you, Rich. I'll take advantage of other opportunities to leave the time for questions. I've also only got a few more minutes, and I'm going to do group photographs and depend on that. So I'll have to get off in 7 minutes.
Thank you. Just so you know, David wasn't here because he got called to an emergency meeting in Japan. I think has just been in the air, flow back. I think probably either at a hotel or an airport space right now, waiting for the next leg. Is that something? Is that right?
More or less, yeah.
Okay.
Hours away from Toronto. Delighted to be part of it. And I did hear that the President of the United States is going to Japan next week. They did not name a sports trophy after any of us that were there. But apparently
Okay.
it will be a trophy for wrestling in Japan named after your president.
Okay. In the interest of public health, in the interest of public health and not to spur sales of blood pressure medicine, let's not talk about our president this afternoon, if we can. Let me open this up to any questions or comments. And the best thing might be if we can just get the mic to where people are. I see 1, 2, 3, so let's just, my limited vision, we'll move around the room as best we can.
Thank you. Tim Keating with Earthbuilt and former director of Rainforest Relief. When we talk about cities, one of the biggest frustrations for me over the years, and by the way, I've been thinking of climate change since the late 1970s. I certainly don't need to be, told to think more about climate change. It's been on my mind for a very long time. One of the things that is, I think, problematic when we talk about cities and sustainability in cities is the same thing that's been problematic for us for a very, very long time, which is the ability for us to ignore things that are happening far away from us. And the fact of it is, we can't extract ourselves from Earth by living in a city. The fact of it is, probably 98% of the stuff that people use in a city comes from outside the city. So, one of the big misses, I was a forest activist for 28 years. One of the big misses is when we're calculating our climate impact is all the stuff we use. What is the impact of that stuff? And so when people talk about the electrification of buildings, electrification of cars, how we heat our buildings in cities and all this, there's one big, and even the waste, there's one big miss: the production of the throughput of materials for all the people who live in the city. So is that to be accounted for by all the folks who are producing that, all the manufacturing processes, all the mining, all the forestry, etc.? And if that's the case, good luck trying to get all those illegal loggers to account for their climate change emissions when they wipe out all those forests for our tropical hardwoods coming into our cities, or even our paper cups. So this is something that we seriously have to start thinking about. If we are living in a city, the throughput of materials, what is our impact, and not just climate, on biodiversity, on Earth in general. Thank you.
I want to thank you for that, because what I didn't talk about was what's the boundary that we're talking about, because cities are sinks. Everything comes into a city. So I think it's a very, very critical question to think about. And what you're suggesting is that there are a lot of false solutions floating around out there that actually require more resources in the city than what the city can actually do. So, for example, one of my concerns in Toronto with the low carbon is the use of nuclear. If you start thinking about biodiversity, nuclear is a crazy thing to use. I live 30 miles from a nuclear waste facility that, if there was a huge storm, might end up in Lake Erie, and I might be drinking it. So so is that then therefore a good solution, or is that a false solution? Or you think about cars. If you think about, it's not just the energy source of the car, it's every single thing that goes into making an automobile. So the whole electric car thing is highly problematic and just appeals to the upper echelons of people. So I think that we're actually not allowing ourselves to understand what the impact of this crisis is. And if we don't start allowing ourselves to understand it really soon, I think we're going to be in really serious problems. Because if we rely on the same economic, exploitive, and extractive system that we live in right now, we're not going to be able to actually solve the problem, because that is the destruction of the earth is what's doing it. So can we really, really move back? I don't really know, but it would be really nice, as the people who are in the Extinction Rebellion say, for God's sakes, tell the truth about what's really happening. And people are not telling the truth. So I thank you. That's very, very important.
Does that also connect to the notion that you can't solve a commons dilemma with capitalism, with totally independent free action? It won't work.
Yeah, we can't solve it with the way that we've been working so far. Yeah.
David?
Really quick. First of all, 2000, the world urban migration with cities.
I'm sorry, we're having trouble hearing again, David.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So, about 2008, the world has become in the center of people in urban areas. So, cities are going to have to be part of the solution, however we describe that. I think the really important going forward. Second point, I agree that we have to search out worry about issues, how and what we do in cities, as on the environment. I think that's extremely complicated, but very, very important going forward. And I have a question, but it's not out there, so I'll leave it at
Gary.
Hi, I'd like to raise an issue that's been touched on tangentially, which is biocentrism and anthropocentrism. I think we have to come to grips a little bit more fundamentally with the nature of the human brain. And the human brain obviously evolved in a situation where anthropocentrism, unfortunately, was adaptive in the short term. And so by trying to get people to reorient or rethink about biocentrism and anthropocentrism, I think we need to come to grips with, let's take a look at the environmental movement, at least in North America. What was the main tipping point of Earth Day and the environmental movement? I would argue it was Rachel Carson identifying that pesticides were screwing up human health. So to me, what it means is, instead of trying to move people away from anthropocentrism to biocentrism, recognize that that's not going to happen in a time frame that will save us. So what I think we need to do is jump on more, okay, given anthropocentrism, the way the brain works is to increase an understanding without fear, and that's the tricky part, of what climate change is going to do to your personal health, your family's health, mental or physical. And I think if we can sort of think about Rachel Carson as an analog, and again, I think it's tricky because, as we also know, it's a U-shaped function. So if there's too much fear, too much threat, it'll backfire. On the other hand, I think we need to come to grips with the way the brain is. We have an ancient brain in a world that it's no longer well suited for, but we're not going to be able to do this in time. So I think we have to come to grips with anthropocentrism. That's the way we're wired. We're wired for the immediate threat that's right in front of us right now that's going to hurt us. Some people understand that that's what climate change is, but most people don't.
Comments, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3. And by the way, let me just say, my scheduler in chief, Jessica, has said there's nothing else in this room. If people want to stay beyond 12:15, I'm happy to. If people have to leave, you've got what you've got.
So, Gary, thank you for that. It's true. As you know, the ancient brain is one of the one of the dragons of inaction that we face. So, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but there's a lot of people who are doing everything possible, and in my little eco-menagerie, I call them mules because they're carrying the load. So, one thing I wanted to mention earlier is I think we could do a lot more to reward the people who are doing everything they can already, with financially or just with recognition. Those are the people who've overcome their anthropocentrism to understand the real situation. But for all the rest of the people who are not in this room right now, the trick is to make doing the right thing easy, structurally or whatever, bike lanes being the epitome of that, trying to make it easy. But I think we don't have to convince those people that climate change is an issue, the ones who are totally occupied with other things in their lives. Just make it the easiest, natural way to go, and that ancient brain will follow that, even if they're not on board with climate change. So you've got mules, we need to reward them, and we've got non-mules, we have to just make it really easy for them to do the right thing, or the natural thing.
Rick, can I
Can I
Yes.
make another quick comment?
Yes.
I think that's really interesting, and I wasn't aware definitely of that H-plane issue, although I am aware of all the official people are aware of the and one of the responses to that will that raised a very good point is from the Mayor of London, England, Steve Paul, who is accelerating your justice program. Talking about it does part of issue and in particular deal with very high class among children in London. It's factually true. So when they call it the ultra low and that's the charge safety. And the BBC did the interview with a local school in London that had a whole row of asthma inhalers for general use because asthma is so prevalent. And I think it's an interesting example of appealing to that way of thinking. Very immediately sees and folks very poor air quality. You're getting an underlying issue, the overcome across the board transportation. And that strategy did find that methodology.
David, I apologize. I think we're losing you again, and I'm not sure if the media people can help with that. But I'm just going to ask you to hang on for a minute. Okay, and we're gonna go to some other people in the audience until we can get you back.
Can I make a quick comment? So to your point, I think the idea of anthropocentric or biocentric poses these things in opposition, but I think it's really a question of how do we construct the self. And now we do have this very disconnected sense of self, but I think people still see ourselves as embedded in a system. It's just the socioeconomic system, and somehow we've come to see ourselves as not being connected to the ecosystem, even though those are one and the same. And when you look at why people are so defensive around climate change, it's because it's so threatening to the system that we've come to see as being our home and providing our food and our housing and our partnerships, even, etc., and our access. But it's a question of reshaping that sense of what it is that constitutes us. It's not really that you don't have to move away from being centered on the self per se, as long as the self is inclusive of what actually does hold us. And I think that's what's needed, is to reshape that. I think trying to get people to put the earth first or something is actually, for me, a very big delusion, because it also isn't first. This is all one interconnected system, but we've lost the capacity to see the interconnectivity.
Yeah. So you have to really consider, I believe, a lot of the tools that are available for getting people excited about climate change. Arlington, Virginia, we don't have a mayor, unfortunately, but we're very progressive. So 10 years ago, they set up a program called Fresh Air, which AIR is Arlington Initiative to Reduce Energy. And they set up goals and they met all their goals, and they were picked up on LEED. And so we've got all the county buildings are LEED. All of the people who get permits to build are LEED. We have the Green Home building and remodeling program, in which we've got county staff will accelerate your permits and give you technical advice if you do a green home for yourself. The last thing is, we've also done the Green Living Challenge, in which we've had neighborhoods compete to see who could adopt more green behaviors. So it's all there to happen.
Excellent. Okay. 1, 2, then we'll go over to the other side.
So thank you very much for the cross-section of care, intellect, and influence that has joined together in this room, including David from afar, part of the room. So my name is Jessica. I worked with Rich as a co-chair for the conference. But I'm also representing AIA New York and a local Planning and Urban Design Committee initiative that's working on a concept of a net zero neighborhood as a way to understand all of these principles of climate change, but at the scale of something that is tangible to people. And David, my question, and I think it goes across the board, and happy to continue the conversation if we need to later, but that your work at C40s sets up a really interesting question when you bring up the fact of consumption-based data as opposed to emissions-based data. I'm wondering about the potential of effects of consumption-based data as it relates to this people science question that a lot of the people here are relative to as a sort of second effect of most of the emissions-based policies that are being laid out as an initial step in.
And David, if you want to respond to that, why don't you take a crack, and if the bandwidth just isn't going to make it happen, we'll let you know and apologize.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So loud I can even hear me. I think that's a great question. I guess two comments. First of all, something like the zero emission neighborhood, I think is fantastic. Show people
To go to her first, then you.
to live a very urban way, far more in harmony with the rhythm of life and actual people. In an ideal world, these cities won't just address climate change, but biological, cyclical places that here influence the original city where you work and live in, and you have to count energy work, for example. And I think in that context, consumption work can be very useful. I do think it's challenging at the beginning. In some ways, it's talk to people about lowering energy use, improve transportation, improve building, and so forth. It's relatively easy to talk to them about waste, and people take me to politicians why you create so much and so forth. But looking at the underlying consumption issues, and what I would look at economic research with planetary boundaries, is a more challenging conversation to have with people. I think potential is important. Because people can start to make people strong. Well, I asked strong example again of how you have that conversation in a way that works. Although I have seen things that talk about how that conversation is addressing people. I would say it's an area where you need real collaboration on it. Psychologists and politicians, we can move that towards the first part. Oh, yeah, man.
Thank you, David. It's breaking up a little, but thank you. Okay, we're going to do three more. We got 1, 2, and Michael's over there. And thank everybody. And if anybody wants to continue chatting.
Hi, my name is Mimi Narayan. I'm at the Pew Charitable Trust, which is a foundation in Washington, D.C., and I work at the Health Impact Project, which is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trust. And one thing that I just want to pick up on Gary's thread is that I wanted to bring sort of front and center to the climate discussion that we have found to be effective in making it immediate and local and personal and emotional is bringing in health and making health front and center in terms of the lens through which we look at climate change and climate change impacts. And I'm wondering, as environmental designers here, and I'm an architect and environmental designer by training, all we do all day, all our research is around the social determinants of health. But how can we bring public health folks into the discussion with environmental designers, into the discussion with climate change? I know we are currently funding 4 cities across the United States to actually implement solutions through a health lens on climate solutions. And so I would really love to hear more about sort of how we're talking about the drivers of health and how climate change discussion can move forward that way.
We have someone on the panel that wants to respond to that.
I think, in purely strategic terms, to bring health into the equation is a good idea, because if you look at people's concerns throughout their whole life, health is right at the top. And, the old studies show that if you ask people to rank all the important things, climate change is still number 22, unfortunately. So in purely political strategic terms, to tie climate change to health, which is valid, is a very good strategy, of course. And we are in Canada, for example, we're seeing migration of pathogens moving north and whatever. So again, as Gary mentioned, you have to watch out for how much fear you create, but certainly tying climate change to health is a good general strategy, I think. Yes, it makes it personal, experiential, and the other things that I mentioned. So it's one very good strategy.
Yes, I would like to say just a bit.
Yeah, you want to go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to say just that health is an important dimension, which is part of the European strategy for nature-based solutions, for implementation of nature-based solutions, because making healthy cities is related to making more equity, more inclusive cities and more inclusive environments. This is implemented into this equation. So, for example, a way of including health is a way that relates the nature and the greener spaces for mitigating the impact of climate change, but for also making safer cities, because the greener spaces is demonstrated that are related to some precursors of violence and some precursors of aggressive behavior, and this is also related to healthy environments regarding well-being.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that too, because I think that health, depending upon what you mean by it, if you mean the absence of disease, then I know you're not talking about that. So you're talking about well-being and the ability to take control of your life and be able to make decisions. I think the understanding what health is based on opens up many, many avenues, like food, whether it's local food, organic food, where does your food come from? And there are movements all over the world right now in terms of food generation. And this is a critical issue in terms of what we're going to do with respect to climate change. So food production, how we do it, how we're poisoning the earth. It doesn't do us any good to be able to have food that is actually not really good for us. I also realize, like, water, clean water is really important. But most people don't know that they're walking around 70% water. I tell my students all the time, look, you're 70% Lake Erie, and anything you put in Lake Erie is going to end up in your body. So it's like, I think that if we do health in such a way that it actually reconnects us to the world, that then it has a powerful way of thinking about it. If it's one of the ways that we make people smaller because we're thinking about health, then it actually contributes to the problems of not understanding what Irene was talking about, is the idea that first of all, I'm not even I. We know that now, right? If you're 70% water and then you have all this bacteria and all this stuff going on in your body, what's you anyway? Is really an important question to ask. But if you think about it as the field of your care, then all of a sudden you have the more possibility of having a much more ecological view of yourself. And health in that respect is a very positive way to think about climate action.
Very quick comment to say that if you follow budgetary processes at the federal level, the one agency that doesn't suffer from the threat of budget cuts is the National Institutes of Health. So no matter what, we know that especially the middle to late aged people who run the federal government care about health, but and would be willing to fund it. But I think the other point that folks have made a few times about not overwhelming people with fear, the key thing is, and this is a finding that comes from public health and smoking, is you give people enough information to get them concerned, not completely freaked out, and then you immediately channel that into solutions. Because if you don't give people something to do, then they're going to do it internally by checking out of the problem or blaming the messenger or something. But if you can bridge between the sense of personal concern about health to something that can alleviate that concern, then you actually potentially have a powerful lever. But I think it's important that we're talking about prevention here. So anyway, to just think about that when designing the communication, but I do think that health goes right, to people's deepest concerns.
Great. Last comment or question from Michael Edelstein, who I know has been dealing with these questions for a career.
Yeah, I've been actually dealing with these things since the 1970s, but all my thinking has been shaken up by something that I don't think was mentioned, which is at the end of last year we had 4 reports come out at the same time. One of them was the Lancet report on health, which ties in the health piece. One of them was the National Climate Assessment in the United States, and then there were 2 UN reports, the GAP report and SR15. And picking up on the last one, basically the nexus of it was that we're going to be pushing 1.5 to even 2 degrees centigrade rise before, well, maybe even well before mid-century. So that translates into a massive realization that climate changes are not in the future. They're now. They're going to be accelerating rapidly in the near future. And the timelines we have to talk about this and to implement change are not leisurely timelines, but they're really on an emergency mobilization basis. So in my mind, that changes the whole way I begin to think about these issues. These are not things for conferences. These are things for really sitting down and making change. And I would have loved to have seen this great session that you organized be actually the beginning of the conference, and then we roll up our sleeves and get to work on this. And I'd like to see us actually create opportunities to do that, because I think, and not in the far future, in the near future, because we really need to push this. But just comments on the timeline.
And to support that, I just want to say that in terms of health also, we tend to take action once we have the symptoms, right? And so both in terms of local weather is huge and health impacts, helping people see how this is their reality, our reality now, I think is really key. So agreeing with you.
I know we don't have much time left, so I usually summarize my talks by saying, if you're not at the table, you're not in the policy. So get active now.
I would like to just, did you have something, Linda? I would just like to say that my one thought now is that I would like to see if I can work with David after this session to maybe set up some kind of online forum where people from this organization, IAPS, and with this expertise, Division 34, et cetera, maybe can have some direct interaction with what's going on at C40 as a way of people like David being able to ask questions to get feedback in a way that continues beyond one small session. And David, if you're amenable to that, we can work on that when we have some time after the conference.
Okay, let's see what we can do. It's way beyond me. I think it's the city staff really, that's kind of dialogue. It's been superb for me today, very helpful, and I'll work with Rich and see what we can do. I'll act with the urgency that's required and do it in demonstrating solutions.
Thank you, David. Linda, I'll leave you the final comment if you'd like to.
Okay. God bless the earth. Thank you.
Linda always has the right way to end. Thank you very much, everybody, and there's other sessions going on. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, David. I appreciate you being patient with us through all of this, and look forward to seeing you when you get back to New York. Thank you.
Well, the reason my name is from Russia, but New York.